Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight. Let the mystery begin. The rain came softly that evening, a whispering drizzle that clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead and shimmered faintly in the lamplight. The church bells had long since fallen silent, and the only sound was the gentle clatter of crockery from the kitchens and the steady ticking of clocks behind lace-curtained windows. Inside the snug cottages, villagers huddled over their suppers, while smoke curled lazily from chimneys into the darkening air. At the edge of the village, beyond the narrow lane that led to the rectory, stood a small tea shop, the Bluebell Tea Room. It was a charming little place, painted white with a pale blue sign, and known for its warm scones, fresh cream, and the famous apple pie baked daily by Mrs. Constance Arkwright, a woman as proud of her pastries as she was of her spotless reputation. That evening, the tea room was closed to the public but alive with laughter. A small group of friends had gathered for a private supper, a farewell for young Alice Penrose, who was leaving the village to take up a teaching post in Bath. There was Mrs. Arkwright herself, bustling about in her apron, Mr. Harold Blenkins, the postmaster with his polished spectacles, the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Edgewater, and Dr. Lionel Crane, the village physician. The candles flickered warmly, casting golden light upon their faces. The table was set with fine china, and in the centre, beneath a silver dome, rested the pride of the evening, the apple pie. Its crust was glistening with sugar, its scent mingling with cinnamon and clove, Mrs. Arkwright's masterpiece. "Just one more slice for the road, dear?" she urged, her cheeks rosy with excitement as she poured tea from a porcelain pot. Alice laughed, shaking her head. "If I eat any more, Mrs. Arkwright, I shan't fit into my travelling coat." "Then you shall simply have to buy another," said Mr. Blenkins with a wink. And they all laughed again, their voices rising with the sound of rain upon the roof. But among the laughter, Dr. Crane watched silently. His gaze lingered on the pie, then on Mrs. Arkwright. He seemed thoughtful, or perhaps troubled. When the plates were cleared, he excused himself, claiming a late call, and departed into the night, his hat pulled low. By morning, the rain had stopped. The air was damp and heavy, the scent of earth and applewood lingering. And in the upstairs bedroom of the Bluebell Tea Room, Mrs. Arkwright lay motionless upon her bed, the curtains drawn, the candle at her bedside burned to its wick. On the floor beside her, a plate lay shattered, and beside it, a half-eaten slice of apple pie. Her face was calm, almost peaceful, but the doctor, summoned in haste, found none of the peace her countenance suggested. Her lips were faintly blue, and her fingertips tinged with grey. He examined the remains of the pie, sniffed it cautiously, and looked toward the maid who stood trembling in the doorway. "Don't touch anything," he said quietly. "Send for the constable and for Miss Marple." Outside, the village was waking, unaware that something dark had stirred beneath its tranquil veneer. And somewhere in the orchard behind the tea room, a single apple hung untouched upon its branch, gleaming red beneath the morning sun, like a silent witness to the poison that lay within. And thus, in a village of tea and lace, death came disguised in sugar and spice. Chapter: The morning after Mrs. Arkwright's death broke bright and clear, as if the heavens themselves had no knowledge of tragedy. The cobblestones of St. Mary Mead glistened from the night's rain, and a gentle mist curled around the church spire. Sparrows chirped cheerfully, unaware that gossip was about to bloom faster than the vicar's roses. By 9 o'clock, the entire village knew it was Mrs. Partridge, the laundress, who first spread the tale, breathlessly announcing to Mrs. Lemon at the butcher's that Constance Arkwright was found dead in her bed. By the time the clock struck 10, it was common knowledge that she'd been poisoned by her own pie, though no one could say for certain how such a thing had happened. At the corner of the High Street, Miss Jane Marple adjusted her hat against the sun and listened quietly to the babble. Her soft blue eyes, deceptively mild, missed nothing. Though well into her 70s, Miss Marple's mind was as sharp as her knitting needles, and when whispers of foul play reached her delicate ears, she felt the faintest prickle of intuition. "Such a dreadful business," sighed Mrs. Lemon. "To think, that nice woman, gone just like that." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "She was always rather particular about her baking, wasn't she? I cannot imagine Constance Arkwright taking such careless risks with ingredients." Mrs. Partridge leaned in conspiratorially. "They say the doctor looked right pale when he saw her. And there was a plate by her bed, the very same pie she served last night." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "And how curious that she should dine alone when the tea-room was full of company only the evening before." Mrs. Lemon frowned. "You don't think someone put something in it, do you, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, in my experience, people rarely die of mere happenstance when they've just been perfectly well and baking pies the night before." That afternoon, Constable Fred Wilkins, a well-meaning man of limited imagination, arrived at the tea-room to take statements. Miss Marple, under the pretext of delivering sympathy flowers, found herself most conveniently present. The little tea-room was silent now. The cheerful blue sign seemed oddly subdued, the scent of apples replaced by the faint sharpness of disinfectant. Dr. Lionel Crane stood near the counter, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked tired, his dark hair damp with perspiration, his eyes distant. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with a forced smile. "You've heard, I suppose." "I'm afraid one cannot avoid hearing, Doctor," she said gently. "Such things travel quickly here," he sighed. "Indeed, I found her myself. I had examined her only last week. A touch of indigestion, nothing more." "I never would have expected—" He stopped, glancing toward the stairs. "Forgive me, but—" "She was a proud woman, Miss Marple, prone to moods, but hardly reckless." "I cannot understand it." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "And you believe it was accidental?" Dr. Crane hesitated. "There was a smell—" "Bitter almonds." "I'd wager my license it was cyanide." The constable cleared his throat. "You think someone put it in the pie, sir?" Crane nodded grimly. "That or she did herself." "But I see no reason she would." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Who else partook of that particular pie?" The constable flipped open his notebook. "Let's see, Mrs. Edgewater, the Reverend's wife, Mr. Blenkins, the postmaster, Miss Alice Penrose, and Dr. Crane himself." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Then we may be fortunate it was only Mrs. Arkwright who suffered. Might I see the kitchen, constable?" Wilkins hesitated, then shrugged. "I suppose there's no harm." The kitchen of the Bluebell tea-room was as spotless as legend described. Copper pans hung polished on the wall, and a faint aroma of apples still lingered in the air. Miss Marple moved slowly, her gaze resting upon the empty mixing bowl, the folded apron, the jar of sugar. "Such order," she murmured. "One might almost think she tidied up after herself even in the act of dying." Dr. Crane gave her a strange look. "You think she knew?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "Or perhaps someone wished it to appear so." She bent slightly, examining the sugar tin. Its lid was slightly askew. With a handkerchief-wrapped finger, she lifted it and sniffed. Her nose wrinkled. "Almonds again," she said softly. Dr. Crane frowned. "But that would mean—" "That the poison was in the sugar," she finished calmly. "A clever trick, though a dangerous one. If she used that sugar for multiple dishes, others might have perished." The doctor swallowed. "Then it wasn't meant for her?" Miss Marple straightened slowly. "My dear doctor, that is the most interesting question of all." That evening, the vicarage garden was alive with murmurs. Mrs. Edgewater sat beneath the willow tree, her hands trembling around her teacup. Her eyes darted nervously as Miss Marple approached. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. Simply dreadful."
"Poor Constance." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "A terrible shock."
"You knew her well, I think?" Mrs. Edgewater hesitated. "We were acquainted."
"Not close friends?"
"She could be difficult, you know, proud and rather watchful. She had a way of asking questions one didn't wish to answer." "Indeed." "Yes. Only last week she hinted she knew something about my husband's finances. Absurd, of course. Still, she did enjoy having a bit of gossip to hold over people." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful.
"And she baked the pie herself, did she not?" "Oh, yes, insisted upon it."
"Though Alice offered to help." Miss Marple's fingers stilled upon her teacup. "Alice Penrose?"
"Yes, such a sweet girl, though lately—" "Well, she's been a touch distracted, Dr. Crane, I suspect."
"They've been seen walking together?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, love, the most dangerous ingredient of all." That night, as she sat by her own hearth, Miss Marple gazed into the candle flame. The scent of wax and lavender filled the room. She thought of the bitter almonds, the sugar tin, the quiet unease in Dr. Crane's eyes. Somewhere among the sweetness and civility of village life, someone had stirred poison within and done so with care. She closed her notebook softly. It was no accident. Outside, the church bell tolled once, and the shadows lengthened across her sitting-room wall. "The truth," she thought, "is rarely found in what people say, Teak, but in what they choose not to." Chapter. The first full day of inquiry settled over St. Mary Mead like a gauze, thin, almost pretty, yet concealing edges that could cut. The constable had done what constables in quiet villages do. He'd locked the tea-room, asked several people the same question twice, and written everything down in a hand so neat that it seemed to apologize for the ugliness of its subject. But neatness never solved a murder. Miss Marple, who understood human nature in all its domestic ferocity, knew that already. By mid-morning she set out, blue hat pinned just so, to begin her own inquiries. Less official, more effective. The village, for its part, was entirely ready to help. Windows lifted, doors opened a fraction. Whispers met her on each step. There was nothing St. Mary Mead liked more than a tragedy it could keep at arm's length. Her first port of call was the modest chemist's, a bell-tinkling sort of place where powders stood in labelled dignity and the smell of camphor humbly promised relief. Mr. Artemas Pike, a quiet, precise man with spectacles like a second pair of eyes, appeared from the back with a towel over his shoulder. "Good morning, Miss Marple."
"Ah, my condolences about poor Mrs. Arkwright. Terrible business." "Quite," said Miss Marple, laying her gloves upon the polished counter.
"Mr. Pike, forgive me a direct question, but I gather certain substances in the way of vermin control and the like can be obtained legally here, provided one has need and signs a register?" Mr. Pike's mouth grew prim. "Quite so. Cyanide salts, potassium cyanide in small quantities, occasionally requested for wasp nests. Most regrettable, but necessary."
"I keep such things under lock and key, you understand." "Of course you do."
"And would you happen to recall any such request in recent weeks?" Mr. Pike rather liked being asked to recall. It made him feel useful and, more importantly, official. He disappeared, returning with a ledger bound in leather so old it might have remembered the day it was a cow. He flipped the pages with ceremonious fingers. "Let me see. 2 purchases this month. One from the vicarage, for the garden. Reverend Edgewater's request, duly noted, quantity ½ an ounce. And one a fortnight ago by Dr. Lionel Crane, who required it for medical apparatus sterilization in some special instruments. Of course I required his signature, and he is a trusted professional." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Naturally. May I add," said Mr. Pike, lowering his voice, "that I do not dispense these things lightly. The slightest whiff of misuse and, well, you know me." "I do, Mr. Pike. You are as careful as a house cat in a room full of bone china." She closed the ledger gently. "Thank you. You have been most illuminating," as she stepped back into the brightness of the high street. The information arranged itself tidily in Miss Marple's mind, not as a solution, but as a new embroidery stitch upon the fabric of suspicion. Reverend Edgewater and Dr. Crane had both access to cyanide, and Constance Arkwright had died after a supper attended by Dr. Crane and Mrs. Edgewater. One would not call that neat, but it had the symmetry that life often provides before it twists. She crossed next to the post office. A little bell jangled. The smell of string and stamp gum welcomed her. Mr. Harold Blenkins stood behind the counter, his waistcoat spruced, his hair parted as cleanly as cut silk. He smiled too quickly, and his spectacles flashed. "Miss Marple, we were just speaking of you. Mrs. Partridge said you'd be on the case, as it were. You'll set this village to rights, I don't doubt." "Oh dear," said Miss Marple with a mild glance. "I should be most unhappy to set a village to rights."
Everyone would become dreadfully dull. She folded her hands.
"You were at the tea-room supper, I understand, Mr. Blenkins." "I was indeed, and fine it was, until one learns what it led to." His mouth pinched sorrowfully.
Apple pie, Constance's pride. Who could have imagined?
"Who indeed? Might you tell me who served the pie?" "Mrs. Arkwright performed the honours. She cut generous wedges, as was her custom, and Alice carried plates to the table. I poured tea. The Reverend's wife, Mrs. Edgewater, had 2 helpings, a feather of a woman, but with an appetite, Lord bless her." He paused. Dr. Crane declined a second slice. Said it weighed on him. And the sugar?" The shaker upon the table. "Constance always dusted before serving, just a sprinkle, you know. Then, after the plates were set down, the shaker went round again."
Ritual, I suppose. And who handled it?
Mr. Blenkins blinked, thinking. "Mrs. Edgewater, I think, first. Then Alice. Then myself. Then, well, Dr. Crane didn't, as I recall. He's not one for sweets. And Mrs. Arkwright herself took the shaker last." She laughed.
And said she couldn't
"Resist a little sparkle on her portion, even in her own kitchen. How very thorough of you to remember." Miss Marple's tone made the compliment sound like a kindness, which it was, and also like a test, which it was. "Miss Marple." Mr. Blenkins leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's talk about poison in the sugar."
I only hope, if it be true, that it weren't meant for one of us. I'd as lief resign my post than believe such wickedness sat at our table. Miss Marple's eyes rested gently upon him.
"I do wonder, Mr. Blenkins, at whom precisely such wickedness might have aimed." His Adam's apple bounced. "Oh, I wouldn't know." He looked anywhere but at her. "If you'll excuse me, I must see to the midday post." He fled, and Miss Marple let him go. Flight often says more than a confession. By afternoon the air had turned silk soft, though the village nerves remained frayed. Miss Marple, after a modest luncheon, made her way to the vicarage. She was shown into the morning room where Mrs. Edgewater sat, pale and dappled with sunlight, that the leaves filtered sadly across her lap. The vicar hovered by the fireplace, earnest and embarrassed by the world, as vicars generally are when reality asserts itself beyond sermons. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Edgewater murmured, rising.
How kind of you to call. I hardly slept. It feels
"Quite dreadful to think of our last evening with poor Constance." Miss Marple removed her hat and sat, her knitting bag tucked beside her like a small pet. "Grief sits oddly upon a village chair, my dear. The cushion remembers laughter and is quite put out by tears." Mrs. Edgewater trembled into a smile. The vicar coughed delicately. "If there is any assistance I can render—" "There is," Miss Marple said, with her air of innocent authority. "Your ledger in the garden shed, Reverend, the one in which you note chemical purchases for the grounds. Might I see it?" The vicar looked surprised, then gone to fetch it at once. Mrs. Edgewater traced a finger across the arm of her chair.
"You mustn't think badly of Constance," she whispered suddenly. "She had a way. Oh, I did not care for it, and yet—" "A way of what?"
Miss Marple asked gently, "of knowing." She pried, yes, but she knew. She grew apples and secrets with equal skill.
"And last week she hinted at—" Mrs. Edgewater swallowed.
"At an accounting error in the church fund."
Only a small misplacement, I assure you, and of no dishonesty, merely a confusion of entries.
But the Reverend is so sensitive about appearances, Miss Marple nodded. Appearances have toppled more sinners than sin itself. The vicar returned with a battered notebook.
Here we are. He set it down.
The pages, stiff with damp, contained neat lines. One entry, in the Reverend's own careful hand, read, "Cyanide salts, 1-2 Oz wasps, Mr. Pike, collected 3 October. Your garden is a paradise to wasps, Reverend." Miss Marple asked, mild as milk. "Alas," he said. "The orchard attracts them."
I had intended to set the traps on Saturday.
I locked the bottle in the shed, as one does. The label bore skull and crossbones, ghastly thing, and I keep the key upon my chain. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the key dangling against his waistcoat. "And it has not left your person?" He coloured. "Well, during services upon the hall table, but only then, and our household is the soul of probity." Miss Marple, who never argued with a man's illusions when they gave her more information than his truths, smiled and rose.
"You've been most obliging. Might I borrow your wife for a stroll?"
The vicar agreed. St. Mary Mead was democratic with its grief. They walked slowly under the vicarage elms until the shade became cool as pew wood, Miss Marple said, almost idly. "At table last night, the sugar shaker circulated, I am told." Mrs. Edgewater's hand tightened on her reticule. "Yes, you took it first?" "Yes, I—" She paused, then chose the respectable lie, which is always the costliest. "I only brushed my slice, barely a tap, and afterwards?"
"After Alice had it."
"Then Mr. Blenkin's, I thought no more of it." Miss Marple stopped, turned. "My dear, I think you thought a great deal more of it." Mrs. Edgewater's lips parted. Then with a shiver, she confessed in a whisper, "I did not wish to be seen eating too much sugar. There are those who say I must watch my nerves. So I pretended just a little shake for appearance. Later, after most had finished, I added more. But no one was looking. Quite, said Miss Marple, filing that delicately where such things are filed. From the vicarage, she went to the small cottage behind the tea-room, the one belonging to the maid, Elsie Pratt. A nervous creature, Elsie opened the door with reddened eyes and allowed Miss Marple to sit by the range. "Elsie, child," Miss Marple said, in that voice that opens young hearts, "you adored your mistress."
"I think," Elsie burst into tears. "It's wicked, Miss Marple, wicked!"
She was hard sometimes. Oh, she could cut with words. But she never turned me away.
"And she taught me pastry, proper pastry, with a cold hand and light touch." Her voice crumpled. There.
Miss Marple passed a handkerchief that smelt faintly of lavender and clean drawers. "I should like to understand the kitchen arrangements. The sugar, granulated, where is it kept?" "In the blue tin, ma'am, on the shelf by the window. The caster sugar's in the shaker on the table for service, and a jar in the larder for baking." "And the shaker? Who filled it last?" "Me, ma'am."
"Yesterday morning."
"From the jar, and after the supper?" Elsie swallowed. "I cleared the table, washed up, set the shaker back on the dresser. Mrs. Arkwright said she'd take a slice up to bed. She always did, when we had a thing worth tasting twice. I plated it, and she dusted it herself at the dresser with the shaker, and went upstairs." "Alone?"
"Yes, ma'am." Elsie hesitated. "Only Dr. Crane came back later. After he'd left, that is."
"Knocked at the back door, said he'd forgotten his gloves."
"I let him in. He looked—"
"Troubled. What time?" "Near 10:30. "And the shaker, had it moved?" Elsie wrung her hands. "I couldn't say." "I went up to bank the fire." Miss Marple thanked her and left the child to her sorrow. The lane was quiet, but for the distant bleat of a lamb and the minimalist conversation of sparrows, she stood a moment, and the world shuffled into place. The jar in the larder, the shaker on the table, the blue tin by the window, a last slice borne upstairs under a domestic benediction of sugar. A doctor returning late, gloves forgotten, conscience not. She turned toward the orchard behind the tea-room. The grass, still damp, brushed her shoes. Apples lay in windfall bruises, their scent the soft decay of sweetness. Under a crooked bough she found the wasp trap, a simple bottle, neck narrow, bait caramelly. Several insects floated, delicate and obscene. Nearby, a set of small prints marked the earth, women's likely, or a light-footed man. A heavier tread crossed them, boots perhaps, the sole leaving a faint diamond grid. She lifted her head. Beyond the orchard hedge, just visible, the vicarage shed lurked with a decent English apology for existing. She imagined key and bottle, label bright as warning. Cyanide poisons quickly, she thought, and sugar carries it kindly, the way a mother carries a child, without question. The sun was lowering when she called upon Dr. Crane. His surgery sat at a corner of the green, brass plate, polished to virtue. He received her in his consulting room, which was severe and kind in equal parts, scales, jars,
an anatomical chart that pretended the human form were only modestly embarrassing. Miss Marple, he said, managing a rueful smile.
To what do I owe the honour? She regarded him mildly.
To death, Doctor.
It calls on all of us eventually. Today it is merely borrowing my gloves. She seated herself. You obtained cyanide recently from Mr. Pike. He looked at her, then nodded. Yes, a routine requirement, small quantity. I keep it in the medicine cupboard, locked. And last night you returned to the tea room after you had left. He blinked.
Elsie told you, yes, I had forgotten my gloves. Ah. The single syllable sat on the hand of silence like a coin. And did you find them?
He hesitated, a fractional beat too long.
No, that is, I found them this morning in my coat. I must have been mistaken. Miss Marple's eyes remained pleasant.
You were troubled, Doctor. Everyone is troubled, he snapped softly. Then at once took hold of himself. Forgive me.
I am tired.
Constance was acquaintance, patient.
I dislike losing either. Of course. She rose, smoothing her skirt. One final curiosity. At supper, you declined sugar. I am not fond of sweets. And yet Constance sprinkled your slice as she served it, did she not?
A muscle leapt in his jaw, a small mutiny. She did, yes.
I scraped the top aside, into your napkin.
Which you left. He stared at her. You are remarkably well informed. I am old, Miss Marple said. It compensates for many things. When she left him, the air was changing colour. The village prepared itself for evening prayer and stew pots. Miss Marple returned home, and as shadows stitched themselves to the corners of her sitting room, she lit a single candle and set it upon the table. The small flame burned a narrow tunnel through the dusk. She arranged her notes with care. Arkwright dead, cyanide, sugar shaker, 2 sources of cyanide in village, vicarage, Crane, motive threads, blackmail, pride, love. She brewed a pot of light tea and sat with it, breathing its steam as one might breathe a memory brought nearer. Her eyes half closed. They all took sugar but the doctor. The shaker made its social rounds. Constance dusted the final slice herself and carried it upstairs. The sugar tin in the kitchen smelt faintly of almonds, but not strong. The shaker, perhaps, stronger. The jar in the larder, untested. Elsie filled the shaker in the morning. Who had access afterward? She pictured hands in dim lamplight, Mrs. Edgewater's fretful fingers, Mr. Blenkins's fastidious grip, Alice Penrose's quick, uncertain touch, Dr. Crane's steady surgeon's hold. She saw also Constance's own hand, authoritative, taking what she wanted when she wanted it. Out of habit, Miss Marple glanced at the framed photograph of her late nephew, as if his young face might remind her that innocence was once a possibility. What is innocence in a village? She wondered. Merely the interval before knowledge arrives, the candle guttered. Its errant flicker wrote a thought on the room's walls. If the shaker were poisoned after the first service, then the portion upstairs was murdered separately. If the jar in the larder were tainted, Elsie might be implicated. But the child is not wicked. The blue tin in the kitchen smelt faintly. Someone may have brushed its rim with a contaminated spoon to mislead. One poisons not the vat, but the last touch, the garnish, the flourish, the glittering snowfall of sugar. A knock came, timid as a moth. Miss Marple opened her door to find Alice Penrose, pretty, pale, eyes wide with that peculiar hope the innocent reserve for absolution they have not yet earned. "Miss Marple," she said, twisting her gloves, "may I speak with you? I can bear it no longer. Come in, child." Alice perched at the edge of the settee. "It's horrid of me to say, but I didn't like Mrs. Arkwright. She was watchful. She told me once that the secret of pastry is fear, that one must fear it just enough that the hands tremble.
But she said things that made me uneasy.
She hinted that Dr. Crane and I— Oh, it isn't improper, Miss Marple. We only walked and talked."
And yet she made it sound. Mrs. Arkwright enjoyed the effect of her knowledge, Miss Marple observed dryly.
"It's a parlour game some people play with others' reputations." Alice's eyes shone. "I loved the village once."
"Now I want to leave. And yet if I do, will people say I fled because I was guilty?"
Miss Marple poured tea, and the clink of porcelain calmed the room. "They will say something whatever you do, my dear. The goal is not to control their mouths, but your conscience." Alice took a breath. "You must know last night after supper I returned to the tea-room."
"Only to fetch a book I had left."
The kitchen door was ajar.
"I saw—" she faltered. "Yes?"
"Mr. Blenkins, he was at the dresser, his back turned. He startled when he heard me and said he'd come in by the side door, wanted to check the time of the morning post Mrs. Arkwright wished to send. He left in such a hurry he nearly forgot his hat." Miss Marple let the words settle.
"And where was the sugar shaker?" "On the dresser." "Ah." Alice rose, distraught.
"Miss Marple, I must go. Dr. Crane expects me to— Oh, I don't know why I told you."
"Only I can't bear a wrong conclusion." When the girl had gone, night draped itself completely across the village.
Miss Marple sat very still, hearing the clock count out the moments like a schoolmistress rapping a desk. In her mind, the evening reenacted itself in modest pantomime, Constance's laughter as she dusted the final wedge, the quiet scrape of Dr. Crane's knife lifting sugared crust, the vicar's key lying solitary during evensong, Mrs. Edgewater's second secret snowfall of sweetness, Mr. Blenkins's unnecessary errand by the dresser with the shaker breathing out its delicate glitter, Alice's honesty weaponized by other people's purposes. She blew out the candle and allowed the darkness to be a kind of truth. Someone had intended to kill, she thought, and someone had arranged that intention like a table setting, knife and fork on the proper sides. But which dish had been meant for which guest? The following morning brought a freshness almost indecent. The constable, a solid presence, arrived to say the county inspector would take over.
"Inspector Locke," he told Miss Marple, chest puffed.
Sharp as they come. Inspector Locke appeared by noon, a man with a chin that didn't argue and a moustache that made promises. He took the tea-room in at a glance, arranged officers, and viewed Miss Marple with a polite wariness. He had read somewhere that one humoured old ladies in villages. He attempted to do so with grace. "Mrs. Arkwright died of cyanide poisoning, beyond question," he said, reviewing a typed report. "The slice at her bedside, dusted with sugar, contains clear traces. The shaker, empty now, contains residue, sufficient to taint a single serving. The jar in the larder is clean." He raised his brows. "Someone doctored the shaker between dinner and bedtime." Miss Marple's smile was small and satisfied. "How very precise." "Furthermore," Locke continued, "the blue tin of granulated on the kitchen shelf shows a faint odour, likely contamination from contact, perhaps the rim touched by a spoon that had handled the shaker."
"An attempt at misdirection," Miss Marple nodded.
"Quite," he eyed her. "You already suspected as much." "I am old," she said amiably. "It makes one suspicious by economy." They stood in the kitchen, an altar of cleanliness. Locke's gaze ranged over shelves and jars. "I've learned," he said, "that both the vicar and the doctor obtained cyanide legitimately in recent weeks." "Yes." "Which is very convenient. For a would-be murderer, I mean." "Yes," Miss Marple said again, and then almost absent-mindedly, "Do you happen to know, Inspector, whether Mr. Blenkins has any mechanical hobbies? Photography, perhaps?" Locke frowned, surprised.
As a matter of fact, he does.
"Keeps a little dark room at the back of the post office."
Not uncommon. Why?
"Cyanide is a fixer in some old processes," Miss Marple murmured. "Though a man like Mr. Pike would, I think, supply safer alternatives today. Still habits linger," Locke made a note. "You've a mind like a pantry, Miss Marple. Everything labelled, everything in its place." His tone was dry, but his respect, though reluctant, had begun to recruit itself. They interviewed the company all over again. Mrs. Edgewater trembled. The vicar tried to protect her tremors with his bland conviction. Alice pleaded goodness and the right to hope. Mr. Blenkins produced his stammering alibis with the regularity of a counterclock. Dr. Crane's coolness warmed and cooled like a fever that could not decide upon a crisis. Locke observed Miss Marple embroidered the observations with human thread. In the late afternoon, when the inspector had gone to telephone the laboratory, Miss Marple visited the orchard once more. Sunlight lay like honey upon the grass. The fallen apples had begun to sweeten into wasp lure. She wandered to the fence abutting the vicarage shed.
A scrap of something caught upon a splinter. Linen?
No, paper.
Very small, very thin, like the corner of a packet label.
She teased it free with a hatpin and held it to the light, i.e., the rest torn away. It might have said cyanide or aside or pride. Paper tells truths with an inconvenient economy. She tucked it into her reticule and returned to the tea-room gate, where Elsie Pratt stood with red eyes and a clean apron. "Elsie, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, "was your mistress expecting any early morning post today?" Elsie blinked. "Yes, ma'am. A registered letter. She said it was important. Mr. Blenkins was to bring it before opening time." "Registered?" "So he said, ma'am."
Needed a signature. How dutiful of him, Miss Marple replied, and her eyes, which could be as soft as wool, hardened to the clarity of glass. That evening, Miss Marple again lit a candle at her small table.
She did not knit. She did not even sip tea. She listened to the candle's faint hiss and pop as a tiny bubble in wax burst and sealed itself again. In the flames' dance, she saw the shaker turning hand to hand, glittering with a dust not of sugar alone, and she saw bedside where sweet things go to die, a thought, subtle as the lemon zest that finishes a tart,
ran along the edges of her mind. What if the last sugaring were not merely indulgence but insurance?
What if Constance, who did nothing by halves, had tasted suspicion as keenly as cinnamon? What if she had suspected the sugar below and so dusted from a different height, or from a different stock? She rose, took her shawl, and slipped back to the silent tea-room like a shadow with purpose. Elsie admitted her. The constable on watch knew better by now than to argue with Miss Marple after dark. In the kitchen, neat as a proverb, Miss Marple walked to the dresser. She opened the drawer below, then the one beside. In the third, she found what she sought, a small paper packet, folded into itself, labelled in a careful hand, Castor Sugar, Reserve. The packet was nearly empty. "Elsie," she said without turning, "did your mistress keep a private reserve of castor sugar here?" Elsie nodded. "For finishing," she said. "For a sparkle, you know." "And did you fill the shaker from the jar in the larder in the morning?" "Yes, ma'am." "So last night, before the meal, the shaker might have been filled from this reserve packet rather than the larder jar." Elsie's eyes grew large.
I suppose.
"She often did that. It's finer. She says it lies upon pie like fresh snow." Miss Marple's mouth thinned. "Snow shows tracks," she whispered, and then aloud, "Thank you, Elsie dear. That is all I needed to know for today." When she stepped again into the night, St. Mary Mead felt rearranged. The streets were the same, the hedges clipped with the same moral satisfaction, but beneath the symmetry a new pattern had emerged, the way threads on the back of embroidery finally make sense when you've guessed the picture. Someone had not merely seized an opportunity, someone had composed it. The shaker, the reserve packet, the late-night visit to the dresser, the promise of an early registered letter, the path by the orchard fence where a label shred had flirted with a splinter. Each was a bar of music, and Miss Marple, who had no ear for fashionable composers, nonetheless heard the tune, yet the final note refused to fall. One question hovered, delicate and cruel as a wasp's wing. For whom was the poison meant? Constance had lived to eat that final sugared slice. But was that a murderer's triumph or a murderer's failure? Miss Marple closed her door behind her and set the latch. In the hallway mirror, a small old lady looked back, modest, a bit tired, with eyes that contained too many village tragedies. "Tomorrow," she told the reflection softly, "we will fetch the truth down from the high shelf where someone has hidden it. And somewhere across the green, in a tidy room with a brass plate on the door, Dr. Lionel Crane sat alone, his hands quiet on the desk, the unused gloves lying between them like a pair of unsent letters. He turned his head at a small sound, perhaps the creak of a stair somewhere, perhaps only the hinge of conscience, and said into the empty room,
very quietly, "I didn't mean but the room,"
which belonged to no one but the night. Did not reply. Outside, a wind scraped gently at the eaves. The village slept, as villagers do when they trust themselves, and in that sleep, somewhere, a liar rehearsed the truth he would tell tomorrow. A truth. Miss Marple knew that would be almost, but not quite, good enough. Chapter 3, morning came pale and breathless, with a sky that looked scrubbed clean after confession. In the calm stillness, St. Mary Mead seemed almost innocent again, until one remembered that innocence, like cream, sours swiftly when stirred by deceit. Miss Marple was awake early, her knitting untouched. Instead, she sat at her writing desk with a neat list before her. 5 names, 5 possibilities. Each name was a thread leading to one apple pie and one death. She drew a delicate line between them, forming a quiet geometry of guilt by mid-morning. Inspector Locke had returned to the tea-room, his boots muddy from the walk across the orchard path. He was not a man easily impressed by coincidence, but he had learned, grudgingly, that coincidences around Miss Marple rarely survived scrutiny. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted, tugging his hat. "I've had reports from the laboratory. Cyanide residue confirmed in the shaker. Only trace amounts. Enough for a single serving, as I said yesterday. No fingerprints except those of Mrs. Arkwright and her maid." Miss Marple poured him tea as though he were a visiting curate. "1 serving," she murmured. "Yes, that seems rather
selective, doesn't it?"
Locke grunted. "Too neat for a random act, certainly. You still think it wasn't suicide? My dear Inspector, if Constance Arkwright had chosen to die, she would not have done so with pastry on her conscience. She would have left a note in perfect grammar and burned the teapot for good measure." He smiled faintly. "Then we're looking at murder." "Indeed, though perhaps not of the sort one expects." Locke sat forward. "You mean the poison wasn't meant for her?" "Possibly. Well, possibly it was, but not in the way we imagine." They began their day's inquiries anew, starting with Alice Penrose. The girl sat pale and fidgeting in her small lodging near the green, her suitcases half packed for Bath. When Miss Marple entered with the inspector, she leapt to her feet as though expecting accusation. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "we've no wish to frighten you."
"We only wish to understand." Alice clasped her hands.
"You think I had something to do with it?" "Not at all. But you were close to Mrs. Arkwright, and perhaps—"
Alice hesitated. Yes, he was angry, not at me, but at her. He said she liked to meddle.
"But he would never harm her, Inspector."
"Never." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Of course not."
"Tell me, Alice, did you see Mr. Blenkins after supper?" Her eyes widened. "Yeah, just for a moment. He was leaving the kitchen." He looked nervous. "I thought nothing of it, then." Miss Marple nodded slowly as if noting a bead in a rosary of evidence. "Thank you, my dear." Their next call was to the post office. Mr. Blenkins stood behind the counter, polishing the brass scales, though they gleamed already. He started visibly when the inspector entered. "Morning, sir," he said with brittle cheer. "Busy day with the post? Our dreadful business, poor Mrs. Arkwright." "Quite," said Locke, his tone deceptively mild. "You delivered her post, didn't you?"
Registered letter yesterday morning?
Blenkins blinked. "Why, yes, Inspector, though it turned out she was gone before I arrived." "Curious," said Locke. "Did she tell you what the letter concerned?" The postmaster hesitated. "No, sir."
Only that it was private. Legal, perhaps. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly.
"And did she mention whom it was from?" Blenkins swallowed. "A solicitor in London, I think. Partridge and Lowe." The inspector jotted a note. "Will inquire. Tell me, Mr. Blenkins, you were seen in the tea-room kitchen after the supper, were you not?" Colour drained from the man's cheeks.
I only went in to fetch my umbrella.
"I'd left it by the dresser." "The same dresser where the sugar shaker was found?"
Asked Miss Marple gently. He licked his lips. I didn't touch it. Of course not, she said, her voice as soft as cotton.
"But tell me, do you still dabble in photography? Developing your own plates?" He looked startled. "Why, yes, Miss Marple, though not much these days." Locke's eyes narrowed.
"And you keep chemicals for that?" "Old ones, yes. Harmless by now. Where do you keep them?" "In the back room. Locked cupboard." Miss Marple's smile was faint.
"One should always keep dangerous things locked away, don't you agree?" He stared at her, then nodded too quickly. "Quite right, Miss Marple. Quite right." From there, Miss Marple and Inspector Locke crossed the green to Dr. Crane's surgery. The doctor was in his consulting room, but his calm veneer had begun to crack. There were shadows beneath his eyes, and a tremor in his voice when he spoke. "Miss Marple, Inspector, if you've come to accuse me, do it plainly." "We've come to listen," said Miss Marple kindly, "and to understand why you returned to the tea-room late that night." His jaw tightened.
"I told you I'd forgotten my gloves." "Gloves which you later found in your coat pocket," she reminded him softly. He sighed. "I went back because I was worried."
"Constance had said something before I left. She mentioned Alice and me. She made a joke of it, but there was an edge. I thought perhaps I should speak to her, ask her to keep her peace. When I reached the tea-room, the lights were out."
"I saw no one. I left, and you did not enter the kitchen?" asked Locke. He hesitated.
"No." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You are a poor liar, Doctor."
"I do not mean that unkindly." He looked away.
"All right."
"I went in only for a moment. I saw the table still laid."
The sugar shaker was there. I thought of her tea, of the smell earlier that evening.
I unscrewed the lid and sniffed. I knew then something was wrong.
Bitter almonds. I left at once. Locke's eyes flashed.
"You didn't report it?" "I couldn't be sure."
I thought perhaps it was my imagination, or that some residue from my instruments had—" He broke off, despair in his face. "Dear God, you must believe I meant no harm." Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. "Doctor, sometimes harm comes not from malice, but from the silence that follows fear." They visited the vicarage last. Reverend Edgewater greeted them nervously, his collar tight, his spectacles fogged. "My wife is resting," he murmured.
"This business has been—"
"Most distressing." "Of course," said Locke. "We won't trouble her. Just a few questions. You obtained cyanide recently for wasp traps?" "Yes, but it remains locked in the shed. I assure you, Inspector, I have not touched it." Miss Marple's voice was mild. "The key is still on your chain, I see." Yes, always." He drew himself up. "You can inspect the shed if you wish." They did. The small wooden building stood behind the vicarage hedge, filled with tools and the faint smell of damp earth. The cyanide bottle sat on a shelf, label intact, half full. Miss Marple noticed a faint smudge on the glass. Not fingerprints, but a brushed edge, as if something had grazed it recently. She ran her gloved finger along the shelf and found a trace of fine white powder, sugar dust, impossibly faint, yet unmistakable. Her heart gave a small—
"Quiet beat, Inspector," she said softly.
"The murderer has been tidy, but not immaculate." That evening, back in her sitting room, Miss Marple arranged her notes by candlelight.
Outside, the wind stirred the hedgerows.
Inside, the flame trembled, painting golden shapes upon her wallpaper roses. She reviewed each suspect in turn, not merely their actions, but their nature. Mrs. Edgewater, nervous, gossiped about finances, feared exposure, but too frightened to act. Dr. Crane, intelligent, passionate, compromised by affection and pride. Capable of guilt, but not deceit. Mr. Blenkins, methodical, self-conscious, secretive.
Loved precision, hated scandal.
The sort of man who would rather kill than be humiliated. Alice Penrose, innocent, naive, a pawn on someone else's board. Constance Arkwright, proud, controlling, a woman who liked to keep others' secrets like trophies. And somewhere between these names and their motives, the poison had found its way into the pie. She opened her notebook and wrote 2 words beneath the list: the shaker. It had passed through every hand that night, yet the only one who died was the one who refilled it last. Her thoughts drifted to the reserve packet. Constance's private stash of caster sugar hidden in the drawer, and the faint powder on the vicarage shelf. Suppose someone had taken a pinch from that bottle to dust the packet to ensure that when Constance sweetened her own slice later, she alone would taste death. The plan was elegant, personal, vengeful, but it had one flaw: timing. If the poison had been meant for someone else, then Mrs. Arkwright's death was not triumph.
But mistake. Miss Marple closed her eyes.
She could almost hear Constance's laughter echoing from the tea room. Sharp, knowing, cruel. Perhaps she saw it coming, thought Miss Marple. Perhaps she chose to play the last move herself. The next morning dawned clear, and Inspector Locke arrived with telegram in hand. "From Partridge and Low," he said grimly.
The solicitor.
The registered letter Mrs. Arkwright was expecting. It concerned a will. She'd recently changed it. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled.
Indeed, and who was the beneficiary?
He hesitated. Her entire estate, modest though it was, left to Mr. Harold Blenkins. There was silence. Then Miss Marple smiled faintly. How very efficient of her, Locke frowned. You think she suspected him?
I think she knew him.
And perhaps wished to teach him a lesson even in death. That afternoon, under a sky heavy with gathering rain, Miss Marple requested that the inspector summon all the concerned parties to the tea room at dusk. When they gathered, nervous, pale, fidgeting, Miss Marple stood by the hearth, the candlelight reflecting in her calm blue eyes. The tea room, once fragrant with apple and spice, now smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. My friends, she began gently, we are here not only to mourn Mrs. Arkwright, but to understand her passing, and to see that justice, of whatever kind the truth demands, is done. She looked from face to face, at the vicar's trembling wife, at Dr. Crane's clenched jaw, at Alice's tearful eyes, and finally at Mr. Blenkins, whose polished spectacles hid eyes that flickered like nervous candle flames. Mrs. Arkwright, she continued, was poisoned by cyanide placed in the sugar shaker. But that sugar came not from the kitchen jar, nor from Elsie's morning refill, but from a private packet, one Mrs. Arkwright kept in her drawer. Mr. Blenkins shifted.
And what of it?
Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. That packet was tampered with. Someone had brushed its surface with powder from the vicarage shed, the same powder found there yesterday. Mrs. Edgewater gasped softly. Reverend Edgewater paled. Impossible, quite possible, said Miss Marple. But you did not do it. You, Reverend, are far too honest and far too clumsy. Her voice softened. No. The culprit was one who had access to both the vicarage shed and the tea room. Someone precise, careful, accustomed to measuring powders and handling chemicals. Someone who, on the pretext of delivering post, could enter unnoticed. Her eyes found Mr. Blenkins. The postmaster swallowed. You're mad. Why would I? Because, Miss Marple interrupted, Mrs. Arkwright discovered that you had been stealing money from the postal accounts. Small amounts, but enough to matter. She confronted you.
You thought she would expose you.
You had access to cyanide from your photographic hobby, and you knew she took sugar with her pie each night. Locke stepped forward. We found the empty photographic plate packets in your darkroom, Blenkins.
And traces of cyanide on your workbench. Mr. Blenkins backed away, trembling.
It wasn't meant for her, I swear.
It was meant for Dr. Crane, finished Miss Marple softly.
You feared he suspected your theft, and you knew he often dined at the tea room, but Mrs. Arkwright took the poisoned sugar instead. You killed the wrong guest, Mr. Blenkins. His breath came sharp and ragged.
I couldn't. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost sorrowful. You could, and you did.
Constance Arkwright may have been cruel, but she died because she understood you, and because she underestimated how fear can curdle into murder. Mr. Blenkins's composure broke. He sank into a chair, face buried in his hands. She laughed at me, he whispered. Said I wasn't fit to run a tea shop, let alone a post office. She said she'd tell them all. Outside, thunder rolled softly, as if the heavens sighed at human folly. Inspector Locke placed a hand upon the man's shoulder.
That's enough, Blenkins.
We'll take it from here. Miss Marple turned away, her eyes upon the flickering candle on the table. Its flame trembled, reflected in the silver pie knife that still lay beside it. Cleaned, polished, innocent once more, and as the door closed behind the inspector and his prisoner, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer in the quiet tea-room. The scent of apples had faded, but the memory remained warm, deceptive, and faintly sweet. She sighed softly. Poor man, poor Constance. How strange that pride should bake the very pie of its undoing. Chapter 3. Dusk gathered over St. Mary Mead as though the evening itself had decided to lean in and listen. The clouds drew low. The hedges stood like black lace against a paling sky. Within the Bluebell tea-room, lamps were lit and shades drawn. The scent of soap and polish had replaced the fragrance of spice, yet the place retained a ghost of apples, a memory as persistent as remorse. Inspector Locke had obliged Miss Marple's request with a certain wary deference. He had seen enough to know that when this small, neat lady said now, the truth was generally dressed and ready. So the chairs were arranged, the doors attended, and those who had supped upon pie and peril were invited one by one into the hush. Mrs. Edgewater came first, shawl clutched like a penitent's petition. The Reverend followed, face set to decency, hands slightly unsteady. Alice Penrose entered close behind Dr. Lionel Crane. They did not walk together, but the air between them seemed warmed by a shared uncertainty. Mr. Harold Blenkins arrived last, escorted, not yet manacled. Inspector Locke was a creature of the law, but not without a pastoral instinct for human collapse. The postmaster's spectacles caught the lamplight. Behind them, his eyes moved like a trapped bird. Miss Marple stood near the counter, hands lightly resting upon its edge. She looked, as always, like anybody's aunt and nobody's fool. The little bell above the door had rung for the last time that day. Silence followed it, as a closing prayer follows the Amen. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said, her voice low, even, almost tender. "We gather not to accuse, no, that has already been done, but to understand. It is a necessary civility before justice takes its course." She glanced to Inspector Locke. He inclined his head. His moustache, of a practical persuasion, did not intrude upon the moment. "You all know," Miss Marple went on, "that Mrs. Arkwright died from cyanide administered by way of castor sugar, dusted upon a final slice of apple pie she carried to bed. What perhaps you do not yet see is the pattern by which such sweetness was turned, deliberately, to bitterness." Her gaze rested upon the familiar objects of the tea-room, the dresser, the shaker, the array of jars like a line of prim dowagers. There were 3 sugars in Mrs. Arkwright's kingdom, the granulated in the blue tin upon the shelf, the jar of castor in the larder for baking, and the little private packet in the drawer, her reserve, as she called it, for finishing, for that sparkle which pleases the eye before it deceives the tongue. Elsie, good child, refilled the shaker yesterday morning from the larder jar. That jar was later tested and found clean. Yet the shaker held residue of cyanide, enough to kill one only. And the blue tin upon the shelf smelt faintly of almonds.
Not because it had been adulterated wholesale, but because some hand,
knowing the habits of neat housekeepers and nervous constables, touched its rim with a contaminated spoon to send us gently,
tidily astray. She turned to Mr. Blenkins. You understand about tidiness.
Mr. Blenkins, you tidy things for a living. Letters into sacks, coins into trays, accounts into columns. And when a number will not settle where you place it, you apply pressure. A penny becomes a pound, a misandry becomes a method. You tidy it until it looks like order. And then you pray, no one like Constance Arkwright will notice. Blenkins's lips parted, protesting faintly, but sound failed him. His hands pleated the edge of his cap with a nervous industry. Miss Marple's tone, kind as tea and sharp as a pastry cutter, continued. 2 men in the village had, upon the surface of things, legitimate access to cyanide, the Reverend for wasps, and Dr. Crane for instruments. But cyanide is not faith to be taken on trust. One must prove its provenance in each particular. In the vicarage shed, where the Reverend kept the bottle, I found upon the shelf a dust so fine and unassuming that one might have mistaken it for pious neglect. It was sugar, an impossible thing to find there unless a sugared object had kissed that wood. The bottle's label had a corner frayed, and in the orchard fence, along the path between this very tea-room and the shed, I found the ghost of a word.
I'd torn paper snagged upon a splinter like a conscience caught upon a text. She opened her reticule and placed the tiny triangle of paper on the counter.
It was a ridiculous scrap, hardly proof of anything, and, precisely for that reason, the sort of truth one could rely on. Someone, she said, took a minute pinch of cyanide from the vicar's bottle and brushed it. Oh, just so, across the outside of a folded packet of castor sugar, the private reserve in the drawer.
One need not poison a stock to poison a habit.
For when Mrs. Arkwright finished a thing, particularly when she wished to bless her own portion, she reached for that packet, shook it, and in shaking it shook the dust upon her hands, and upon the shaker's lip, and upon the sugared hill of pastry waiting upon its plate. Inspector Locke interjected matter-of-fact. Laboratory found the densest residue around the shaker's thread, where cap meets body.
Matches what you describe, Miss Marple. She inclined her head, then turned to Mrs. Edgewater with a softened gaze. And you, my dear, you did what you always do.
You cared dreadfully what people would think. You made a show of declining sugar. Then later, when eyes were on their own plates, you gave yourself another snowfall. Harmless vanity, but unfortunate in its timing. If the shaker had been already tainted for a general purpose, you might, without meaning to, have died.
But it was not yet tainted then. Our murderer had a more refined plan. Mrs. Edgewater shuddered, tears silvering her lashes. Oh, Miss Marple, I am ashamed. Not at all. Miss Marple's smile was a winter kindness.
We have all in our time added sweetness in secret. It is the human condition. Her eyes moved to Dr. Crane. You, sir, declined sugar as a rule. You scraped away what had been dusted upon your slice by Mrs. Arkwright's generous hand, scraped it into your napkin. That napkin would have told us a story had it not, in the confusion, been lost to the washing up. Later you returned, troubled, not vicious, to sniff at the shaker and at what your training told you was wrong. You smell almonds. You did nothing. Fear, again, in its polite English coat, the fear of making a fuss and of being found mistaken. Dr. Crane's eyes, grey and tired, met hers. I deserve that rebuke, Miss Marple. She shook her head. You deserve only to remember that we owe one another our alarms when they are honest. She faced the room once more. So we have the method. But Motive is the other spoon in the drawer, and it rattles differently in each hand. Mrs. Arkwright had a way with knowledge. She stored it as other women stored pickles. She could be kind.
She could be cruel.
Of late, she had pried into the Reverend's accounts, which gave Mrs. Edgewater the thinnest of terrors. She had teased Dr. Crane for walking with Miss Penrose, which gave him a gentleman's anger, and she had cornered Mr. Blenkins about his, shall we call them arithmetic fictions, which gave him, I fear, panic in a waistcoat. She had also, with theatrical cunning or with a stern moral pedagogy, one can never quite tell, altered her will, leaving all to Mr. Blenkins. Partridge and Lowe confirmed it. Why? Because she knew that nothing exposes a thief like an inheritance he does not deserve. She baited him with the very thing his secret self believed he had earned. A tremor passed through the postmaster's shoulders.
She told me she would ruin me, he whispered.
She said the will would make me look a fortune hunter, that everyone would know. I kept the village together. I kept the schedules and the stamps.
I made order. His voice broke.
I only wanted order. Miss Marple's voice was steady. Order is never truly made by pushing figures into corners, Mr. Blenkins. It is made by setting them free upon the page and bearing what they confess. You wanted a world in which no one knew what you were. Mrs. Arkwright wanted a world in which she decided who would be known. She glanced to Inspector Locke, who produced, with bureaucratic elegance, a small envelope. From Mr. Blenkins's dark room, he said. Old photographic chemicals, among them prussiate compounds. Also cyanide traces upon the workbench. Not conclusive on their own, but when one adds... He tapped the envelope lightly. The timing of his presence here after supper, the sighting at the dresser by Miss Penrose, and the sugar upon the vicar's shelf. It draws as straight a line as a ruler can manage. Blenkins leaned forward, fingers whitening upon the chair's arms.
I did not mean her, he said, fierce and cracked. I meant him, the doctor.
He looks at people as if the truth were a picture only he can develop. He stood too close to my accounts when he came to collect for the dispensary.
He would have found the
adjustments. Constance, she was an old woman with a sharp tongue. She would only have made noise. But he would have handed me to the law as if I were a letter to be posted. Dr. Crane did not flinch. I should have, he said simply. Miss Marple's voice cooled by a single degree. And so you fashioned a murder that would look like accident or like self-indulgence. You brushed the reserve packet with poison because you had learned, in your visits, that Constance dusted from it only at the end. You relied upon the ritual. The shaker would be pure during supper, and afterwards, after he had finished eating and gone, you could ensure that only the final, private, solitary sugaring would kill. It was, if I may say, clever. But cleverness is often sabotaged by the very habits it presumes. Her gaze moved to the stairs that led to the quiet bedroom above. For Constance Arkwright was vain, yes, but she was also cautious. She had smelt almonds before. She had served many pies and watched many faces. She had seen a thing that did not please her upon the dresser, a too quick hand, a too innocent exit. She took up the reserve packet. She was not one to be frightened from her sparkle, but she took it with a cloth. She dusted from a height, as if the air itself could be a sieve. She might have lived, had she washed her hands at once and sent for the doctor not to dine but to test. Instead, habit 1. Pride will always take a polite bite before it rings the bell. A faint, helpless sound escaped Mrs. Edgewater. Alice pressed a hand to her mouth. The Reverend murmured a prayer that remained sensibly truncated. Miss Marple went on gently, inexorably. Mr. Blenkins, you returned that night, ostensibly for an umbrella, in truth to ensure your little dusting remained in place, or to add a second stroke if the first had been too timid. You startled Miss Penrose near the kitchen. You left in a rush. And you rose early to bring a registered letter that would perform its own small theatre should the principal actress not appear to sign it. She drew herself up to her modest height. Not much, yet sufficient. You intended the sugar to lie in wait for Dr. Crane upon some other evening, one of his ordinary suppers, a domestic ritual, a death easily ascribed to a faulty batch or to a woman's carelessness. But Mrs. Arkwright's last private vanity collided with your cowardice, and she died in his stead. We owe the dead precision.
I give her this much. Silence followed.
It was filled with the sound of human beings adjusting themselves to a new shape of day. Blenkins's hands fell limp. He looked smaller suddenly. Some air had been taken out of a self that had been pumped too hard for too long. She laughed at me, he said again, but the words had lost their force. She said secrets were like wasps. You must crush them or be stung.
Inspector Locke touched his arm, not unkindly. Enough! He turned to Miss Marple.
You have given us the road and the milestones. We'll walk it by the book from here, Miss Marple nodded. Then, to the room at large, she spoke not as detective, but as neighbour. There is one further civility to be paid. We must be clear who did not kill Mrs. Arkwright. Mrs. Edgewater, you are guilty only of caring too much for appearances. Reverend, you are guilty only of trusting your key in daylight. Dr. Crane, you are guilty only of hesitating before a suspicion that might have saved a life.
And Alice, my dear, you are guilty only of walking in spring with the wrong companion in a village that prefers its seasons predictable. A breath released from every chest, rough or quiet.
Guilt had been apportioned. Innocence, imperfect as always, had been returned to its owners like slightly chipped china. Blenkins stood, swayed, and steadied. For a strange, dislocated instant, he seemed about to apologize for the inconvenience. Then the inspector guided him to the door. The little bell did not ring. It had been hooked up for the evening, and so the postmaster, who had sorted the village's sounds by habit for 20 years, left to an absence of announcement. When the door closed, wind sighed along the eaves. Miss Marple remained by the counter. Her hand strayed, almost unconsciously, to the silver pie knife that glinted with ceremonial innocence. In its polished side, the lamplight was a flame and a blade together. There we are, she said softly. Sliced neat, as Mrs. Arkwright would have preferred. Then more gravely, Inspector, you will be kind to Elsie. She loved her mistress. Let her keep the recipe book.
It is the proper heirloom. Locke's mouth twitched. The closest a man like him came to a smile in such a room.
I will see to it. They dispersed. Inevitably, they did. Mrs. Edgewater and the Reverend went out together, his arm steadying her, her head finding at last its rightful station upon his shoulder. Dr. Crane lingered, not looking directly at Alice, who did not require him to. Miss Marple busied herself with small, unnecessary tidying in order that two young people might find words without an audience. I shall go to Bath, Alice said at last, voice quiet but level. On Saturday.
As planned, yes, Dr. Crane replied.
You must, she looked up then. And you will not write. His smile was rueful.
If I do, it will be to the wrong address.
You must begin free of this, she nodded. They shook hands as though closing a consultation, and for once that formality which had served him as armour served them both as mercy. When even they had gone, Miss Marple blew out one lamp and left another for the constable to mind. She paused in the doorway and looked back at the empty tables. For a moment she saw, clearly, tenderly, Constance Arkwright alive again, cutting the pie with a quick wrist, her mouth primed for pleasure and judgment, her eyes bright with that dangerous feminine amusement that makes men better or worse and never leaves them as it found them. You should have rung for the doctor, my dear Miss Marple told the ghost kindly. You should have washed your hands at once. Then, with a sigh that belonged to no one but herself, she took her shawl tight and stepped into the night. Above the village, the first drop of rain fell like a tiny confession upon the lane, Miss Marple's reflection. The following afternoon, a quiet rain hung over St. Mary Mead. The village seemed to breathe again, softly, warily, as though afraid the air might still contain traces of arsenic or scandal. At the Bluebell tea room, the curtains remained drawn, the tables covered with white cloths as though waiting for absolution. At the edge of the green, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting abandoned in her lap. Her small sitting room was lit only by the delicate tremor of a single candle. Outside, the world was damp and grey. Inside, it was the colour of memory, faint gold and shadow. She was thinking, as she so often did, not of victory but of balance, the sort of balance that human beings rarely achieve, yet always imagine they can, on between truth and kindness, between justice and mercy, between the wish to see and the wish to remain blind. She had seen many murders in her time, though she would never have used the word many. It sounded vulgar, like counting sins in a hymn book. Each case, she thought, was a little tragedy with its own shape, some sharp, some soft, and its own peculiar lesson about what people hide behind politeness. She thought of Constance Arkwright, proud,
Lonely, too clever for the size of her world.
a woman who could never resist turning life into pastry, Miss Marple murmured to the flame, and one who feared, perhaps too late, that her sweetness had gone bitter. There was something almost biblical in Constance's fate. Pride had baked her pie, vanity had dusted it, and fear had delivered it to her bedside. Yet beneath it all had lain something human and small, the eternal need to be noticed, even in one's righteousness. Miss Marple smiled faintly.
And poor Mr. Blenkins, she said aloud, though no one could hear. He only wanted to be respected.
A terrible thing, respect, when one feels one deserves it only by deceit. She reached for her tea, cold now, and sipped. He was not wicked, only weak, she continued softly. But weakness, when cornered, makes the most desperate kind of strength. Her eyes drifted to the photograph of her nephew, young, happy, his future unspoiled by crimes of conscience.
It is curious, Raymond, she whispered, how the simplest objects become instruments of death.
A teapot, a pillow, a pinch of sugar.
Evil rarely requires imagination, only opportunity. She sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain at the window.
The candle flame quivered, and she thought of Mrs. Arkwright's final act, the slice carried upstairs, the sugar falling like a quiet snowfall of fate.
Did she know?
Miss Marple wondered. Did she sense the danger and take it anyway? Because she could not imagine a world where she was not in control. She sighed. Perhaps that was her pride, not in her pies, but in her certainty. And certainty, like cinnamon, must always be measured sparingly. The clock ticked. The flame danced. Somewhere outside, the church bell tolled softly for evening service. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting forgotten, her thoughts drifting into stillness. People, she murmured, are much like apple pies. Their crusts may differ, some light, some heavy, but inside, the filling is always the same mixture of sweetness and acid. She smiled to herself, a little sadly, and closed her eyes. And as the candle burned low, another secret met its shadow. Candlelight Mysteries channel message. If you enjoyed this story, dear listener, subscribe to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Each week, we bring you tales of intrigue, deception, and quiet justice, told in the soft glow of flickering flame. Let the candlelight guide you through another mystery soon. And remember, another secret fades by candlelight.